Okay, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on what time of day you're watching this video. Um, Today I'm going to give a short lecture on Baldwin's story, Sonny's Blues. It's a classic story. It's a story I love, and it is a harrowing story about addiction, but also a beautiful story about music, and particularly live music, some of my biggest passions. You'll need a couple things for this. First, you'll need two pieces of paper, one to take notes on and one to write answers for your quiz to turn in next Tuesday. So pause this and get some paper if you need. You'll also need the Kennedy Enjoy textbook to follow along. Okay, so first is a quiz. Just put your name on this paper, and if you haven't read the chapter and story, you should go do that and come back to this lecture. Okay, welcome back. At the end of the lecture, you also have to answer just a quick question about it. Okay, so first question is define a participant narrator. And again, you can use your book here. Define a participant narrator, and who does the book use as an example of one? The second question is what song does Sonny play when the narrator goes to see him? Okay, now for a short lecture. And first I just want to discuss some key terms that we'll probably return to throughout this course in terms of making arguments about literary texts. And those terms are analytic versus descriptive arguments or claims. And first I'll say that a descriptive argument is one that summarizes the plot or talks about what characters do or think or their motives. Descriptive essentially says what happens in the story, what characters do in the story. Analytic arguments, by contrast, have two components: what the story is saying and how it says it. So again, here's a visual aid. The effects are not very special here. Descriptive arguments are about what happens in the story, and analytic claims are about what the story conveys to the reader and how it does so. So there are what's in both parts of these, what happens versus what a story conveys to the reader. And to differentiate that, we can take an example from the Updike story. A claim that's descriptive about what happens in the story would be something like, Sammy thinks of the customers as sheep. Now that's correct, of course, but it's just about what the characters do or think. Sammy thinks of the customers as sheep. What Updike does is he uses Sammy to comment on the conformity of 50s supermarket culture. So we might think that how and what claim put together is that Updike has Sammy use words like sheep or a simile that compares customers to pigs in order to comment on the conformism of 50s culture. And then we might add to that, he ends up having Sammy reject that culture by quitting the job. So Updike might convey the conformity and then the way in which somebody can take a sort of rebellious and even dangerous kind of action to oppose being a sheep. Okay, that's just an example of a what and how analytic claim versus a descriptive claim. So I'm going to try to continue to come back to that throughout this short lecture, which again should be about 25 minutes to half an hour if I've timed it correctly. Okay, again, I've chosen the story both because I think I wanted to give a good example of how to make an argument, and I just love the story, heartbreaking as it is. It's quite masterful in the way Baldwin puts it together. I want to just start with a passage on the middle of 61, and rather than put this together exactly the way I would write a paper or present it in the manner that a paper would, with a thesis up front and evidence and support throughout, I'm going to just start with the evidence itself. And so I'm really going to do this lecture in the way that I would try to derive an argument, try to come up with an argument rather than the way I would finally present an argument. Okay, so there's this long paragraph at the middle of page 61. I should try to flip there now. And here, the narrator has just picked up his brother Sonny after he's been in prison for some time, and they've been apart for quite some time. Baldwin writes that fourth fifth full paragraph, the long paragraph at the middle of the page. So we drove along between the green of the park and the stony, lifeless elegance of hotels and apartment buildings toward the vivid, killing streets of our childhood. These streets hadn't changed, though housing projects jutted up out of them now like rocks in the middle of the boiling sea. Most of the houses in which we had grown up had vanished, as had the stores from which we had stolen, the basements in which we had first tried sex, the rooftops from which we had hurled tin cans and bricks. But houses exactly like the houses of our past yet dominated the landscape. Boys exactly like the boys we once had been found themselves smothering in these houses, came down into the streets for light and air, and found themselves encircled by disaster. Some escaped the trap, most didn't. Those who got out always left something of themselves behind. As some animals amputate a leg and leave it in the trap, it might be said, perhaps, that I had escaped. After all, I was a school teacher, or that Sonny had. He hadn't lived in Harlem for years. Yet as the cab moved uptown through streets which seemed with a rush to darken with dark people, and as I covertly studied Sonny's face, it came to me that what we both were seeking through our separate cab windows was that part of ourselves which had been left behind. It's always at the hour of trouble and confrontation that the missing member aches. And the missing member there, I think, refers to the amputated leg that an animal leaves in a trap. So it extends the simile from earlier in the paragraph. Those who got out always left something of themselves behind, as some animals amputate a leg and leave it in the trap. Well, what is a simile? It's a comparison between two unlike things that uses like or as. There are a bunch of similes just in this paragraph and many, many scattered throughout this story. Like rocks in the middle of a boiling sea, and then this one about the trap, as some animals amputate a leg and leave it in a trap. So again, in a paper I'd start with a thesis up front, but here I'm just going to start with a question. What is with all these similes? What is the function of these similes? And I would also say, how to put this in the analytic terms, how do these similes help convey what this story is conveying? How do they relate to the content of the story? Well, I think it's quite clear in this passage that the similes relate to the likeness, that is the persistence of these streets over time. These streets hadn't changed, though housing projects jutted up out of them now like rocks in the middle of a boiling sea. The simile is a figure of speech that uses likeness, and here we have streets that are the same even though they've changed. In fact, similes are kind of likeness, use both likeness and difference. They compare two things that are different but also show what is alike about them. And again, the houses are gone, but houses exactly like them dominate the landscape. Most of the boys have gotten out, or boys have gotten out, but boys exactly like the ones we once found themselves smothering in these houses. So here we have change in this place. Boys have left, new buildings, but also stasis. People who are just the same are now there. Buildings that are just the same are now there. I think what Baldwin is trying to convey, the depression of this neighborhood that has not changed over time, has not gotten better and improved, is paralleled by the form that he uses, a bunch of similes that rely on comparisons, descriptions of likeness about things that are different. And again, similes are all over the place in the story. Right on the first page, on page 56, the third paragraph on that page begins, "When he was about as old as the boys in my classes, his face had been bright." We get just later on that page in the same paragraph, I have too many underlined sentences in this on this page and can't find. Sorry, the reason is that the next example is on page 57. Right at the top of the page, the second sentence, these boys now were living as we'd been living then. They were growing up with a rush, and their heads bumped abruptly against the low ceiling of their actual possibilities. Um, and then the next paragraph ends, perhaps I was listening to them because I was thinking about my brother, and in them I heard my brother and myself. Again, the story emphasizes throughout, along with the streets, Baldwin conveys the sameness of the children, the stasis. The children now are just like he and his brother had been then. Again, things haven't gotten better in this neighborhood. It's an awfully bleak story. And again, the how here is that he conveys it through similes and through a pattern that emphasizes sameness along with change. We could go on and list other examples. On page 62 and 3, the narrator talks about how Sonny and Daddy were so much alike. The last paragraph on 62 begins, just the same, this picture gets all mixed up in my mind with pictures I had of her when she was younger. And again, one could go on and on with these mentions of similarity and likeness. This is the reason for all this likeness, again, I think, is to convey the way the world has not changed. On page 64, the narrator's mother addresses this most explicitly. Right in the middle of the page, she says, I ain't telling you all this, she said, to make you scared or bitter or to make you hate nobody. I'm telling you this because you got a brother, and the world ain't changed. And then the narrator says he doesn't want to believe this. But I think we are given to believe this, and Baldwin emphasizes this line, that the world hasn't changed, throughout the story, but here it's put in the wise words of the narrator's mother, and also in this kind of major central scene, which is the last time he sees her. Again, similes throughout the story. Another one that I think will come up again in a little bit later in this talk is on page 57. And this is kind of a random moment that seems not necessarily connected with the rest of the plot. But nothing is random in a well put together short story or poem. So even the things that seem like they may be disconnected probably have some kind of resonance or importance in an overall design of a story. Often things that seem completely random can actually be really good moments to look at and focus on and ask what they're doing there. Trying to figure that out can often help make some sense of the meaning of a text. So there's this random moment in the third paragraph. One boy was whistling a tune, at once very complicated and very simple. It seemed to be pouring out of him as though he were a bird, and it sounded very cool and moving through all that harsh, bright air, only just holding its own through all those other sounds. Here again is a simile. The boy is whistling as though he were a bird. Well, I want you to hold on to that and remember the bird. I think you can probably already guess it has something to do with Sonny's hero, the Charlie Birdman Parker. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Right after that boy, the narrator comes across another boy looking just like Sonny. I almost called his name, and then I saw it wasn't Sonny. Again, lots of likeness. On page 58, about 4 paragraphs from the bottom, this boy who reminds the narrator of Sonny and the narrator are walking down the street, and they walk by a bar. The last line of that fourth to last paragraph begins, when she smiled, one saw the little girl, one sensed the doomed, still struggling woman beneath the battered face of the semi-whore. well, politically incorrect as this statement might be, calling this waitress a semi-whore, when the narrator sees the little girl inside, again, we get this kind of sense of change and stasis that's emphasized repeatedly throughout this story. Okay, I'm going to connect this to what I think is another major theme throughout this story, and just to something in the plot, which is the disconnect between the brothers. They obviously don't see eye to eye. They have different, seemingly different life arcs. The narrator is the brother who seems like an exception to all the to the bleak picture and all the people who get sucked down, who ends up making a better life, and the other one who gets dragged down along with the others. So again, this is a theme of a sort of inability for these brothers to communicate and see eye to eye. On page 60, the last semi-long paragraph, the last paragraph before a lot of dialogue begins, "The 7 years difference in our ages lay between us like a chasm. I wondered if these years would ever operate between us as a bridge." There are two similes in just that sentence. The years lay there like a chasm in between them, separating them. It would be nicer if those years acted as if they were a bridge. Again, we have likeness, and again, we have a use of similes. But here, again, the point of the similes is actually to emphasize the separation between the brothers. Now, Sonny wants to be a jazz musician, and when he tells his brother, the narrator, about that, this is on page 66 and 67. Right in the middle of the page on 66, Sonny says, "What I don't seem to be able to make you understand is that's the only thing I want to do. That is, be a jazz musician." At the very bottom of the page, the second to last paragraph on the page, Sonny was as tall as I was. He had just started to shave. I suddenly had the feeling that I don't know him at all. Again, they're the same height, as tall as I was, but the emphasis here from Baldwin is on their difference and their inability to communicate with one another. Sonny says, "What I don't seem to be able to make you understand is that's the only thing I want to do." And then the narrator agrees and has the realization, "I suddenly had the feeling I didn't know him at all." There's even more of a gap between Isabel, the narrator's wife, and her family, and Sonny. On page 68, Sonny's living in their house briefly. The second paragraph on 68 begins, "Well, I don't know how they stood it," and how they stood Sonny's piano playing. He's been practicing all the time. Isabel finally confessed that it wasn't like living with a person at all. It was like living with sound. And the sound didn't make any sense to her, didn't make any sense to any of them naturally. They began in a way to be afflicted by this presence that was living in their home. It was as though Sonny were some sort of god or monster. He moved in an atmosphere that wasn't like theirs at all. They fed him and he ate, he washed himself, he walked in and out of their door. He certainly wasn't nasty or unpleasant or rude. Sonny isn't any of those things. But it was as though he were all wrapped up in some cloud, some fire, some vision all his own, and there wasn't any way to reach him. Okay, again, lots of similes. It was like living with sound, as though Sonny were some sort of god or monster. He moved in an atmosphere that wasn't like theirs at all. So, well, that's not a simile, but it wasn't like theirs at all. Sonny isn't any of those things, but it was as though he were wrapped up in some cloud, some fire, some vision all his own, and there wasn't any way to reach him. So again, here we get a cascade of similes, but all of these similes are to emphasize the distance and gap between these people, their inability to understand each other. It seems like it's not living with a person at all, even though he acts like a person, so there's likeness and difference. It seems like living with some sort of god or monster. They are completely different kinds of beings and cannot see eye to eye at all. The narrator takes part in this inability to communicate with his brother. But things do get better as the story progresses, and the narrator starts to realize that what he needs to do is try to listen more to his brother. On page 71, right at the bottom, the last paragraph on the page, Sonny plays with his notebook, and something told me that I should curb my tongue, that Sonny was doing his best to talk, that I should listen. Okay, so here's the narrator coming to some realization that he should listen. And again, that's what happens. That's a descriptive claim. The narrator realizes he needs to be a better listener. But I think to move this to an analytic claim, we can say that Baldwin sets up and shows this distance between the brothers. He shows the difficulty of communicating with somebody who's different than you. But then he also shows that listening is a potential route to resolve such difference, that it gives a possibility of connection and understanding. The possibility, because words still seem like they're not always going to work. On the next page, they have a long discussion on 72 about suffering and about whether or not there's anything that humans can do in the face of such suffering. The middle paragraph, the kind of fourth full paragraph of the page, Sonny says, "I believe not that there's no way to escape suffering, but that's never stopped anyone from trying." He looked at me. "Has it?" ? I realized with this mocking look that there stood between us forever, beyond the power of time or forgiveness, the fact that I had held silence so long when he had needed human speech to help him. Okay, so again, communication seems like it could possibly be a help to this chasm between the two brothers. But communication is difficult. The fourth to last paragraph, the narrator says, "I wanted to say more, but I couldn't. I wanted to talk about willpower and how life could be, well, beautiful. I wanted to say that it was all within. But was it? Or rather, wasn't that exactly the trouble? And I wanted to promise that I would never fail him again, but it would all have sounded empty words and lies." Okay, so this sort of self-consciousness about language that the narrator has makes communication difficult. He's worried it will sound empty and like lies. Maybe these words won't be able to fix things. So far things are pretty bleak in the story. We have a cycle of poverty, drug use, very few escaping, very little ability for people to communicate or make connections in the world. But remember that glimpse of the bird boy, the boy like a bird. The final scene of this story, I think, poses music and, by extension, art, and I think storytelling in particular, as a potential bridge, as a potential way of dealing with this problem of a world of suffering that isn't changing and isn't getting better, and as some possible hope of communication and bridging that chasm, some light in the darkness. So I'm going to read a bit of an extensive passage, and we'll be concluding pretty soon here. At the bottom of page 75, the last full paragraph on the page. And again, the scene here, the narrator has come with his brother Sonny to listen to Sonny play, finds out Sonny is something of a piano legend and something of royalty down at the Blues and Jazz Club. and he's watching his brother and the band perform on the stage. So that second to last paragraph on 75 begins, then Creole stepped forward to remind them that what they were playing was the blues. He hit something in all of them. He hit something in me, myself, and the music tightened and deepened. Apprehension began to beat the air. Creole began to tell us what the blues were all about. They were not about anything very new. He and his boys up there were keeping it new, at the risk of ruin, destruction, madness, and death, in order to find new ways to make us listen. For while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, it must always be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness. Now, one thing to notice about this paragraph is its language throughout the music that, and really in this whole scene, throughout the music that the band is playing, Baldwin describes the playing in words that use terms of speech. Creole stepped forward to remind them. Creole began to tell us what the blues were about. In the previous paragraph, I didn't mention, but it says Creole, the dry, low black man, said something awful on the drums. Creole answered, and the drums talked back. Then the horn insisted, and Creole listened, commenting now and then. They seemed to be agreeing. Throughout the music, the playing of the drums, along with the fiddle and the piano, are described in conversational terms. It's as if the musicians are using their instruments to talk to each other and to the audience. So this language pattern I want to suggest, I am suggesting, suggests that music is a kind of communication, a form of connection and communion, of coming together. I'd like to just read the next two paragraphs as well, and look closely at a couple of things that are said there. But I'm going to come back to that last paragraph as well. And this tale, according to that face, that body, this is right at the bottom of 75, this tale, here the music is imagined as a story, as a tale. According to that face, that body, those strong hands on those strings, has another aspect in every country and a new depth in every generation. Listen, Creole seemed to be saying, listen, now these are Sonny's blues. He made the little black man on the drums know it, and the bright brown man on the horn. Creole wasn't trying any longer to get Sonny in the water. And there's a whole set of water metaphors and imagery that I won't get to analyze here, but that would be ripe for doing so. He was wishing him Godspeed. Then he stepped back very slowly, filling the air with the immense suggestion that Sonny speak for himself. Then they all gathered around Sonny. Again, here we see an image of communion, of coming together. They gathered around. And Sonny played. Every now and then, one of them seemed to say amen. Sonny's fingers filled the air with life, of his life, but that life contained so many others. And Sonny went all the way back. He really began with the spare, flat statement of the opening phrase of the song. Then he began to make it his. It was very beautiful because it wasn't hurried and it was no longer a lament. And I'm just going to stop there, but I could keep going. This is actually the moment that I think unites the two strands of argument I've been talking about here. The first strand was the use of similes to convey kind of the stasis and stagnancy at the same time as time passes and changes, and the problem of communication that the brothers face in the story. Here we get, again in that second to last paragraph on 75, that the blues are not about anything new. And yet he and his boys up there were keeping it new at the risk of ruin, destruction, madness, and death in order to find new ways to make us listen. For while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, it always must be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness. So the tale isn't new, but we have to find new ways to make us listen. They're keeping it new, despite the fact that it's not new. The blues here, I think, are an image of this, of kind of stasis and repetition. Things are the same, and yet we try to find new ways of saying it. This might seem bleak, but again, this is also combined with these images and language of communication, which I think suggest some hope here, and necessity as well. The tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we triumph is never new, yet it always must be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness. I think here this image connects again another set of images you can look at throughout this story of light and dark. Okay, so again, finally I think the story is about likeness and similarity, the world not changing, and the particularly bleak situation of how things have stayed bad in Harlem and for African Americans. It also poses the difficulty of communication even between two people as alike as brothers. But then the story, I do think, ends with a hopeful note, suggesting that art poses a model for communication and for expressing that which needs to be heard. Perhaps even if what needs to be heard is a pretty bleak message. Okay, so right now, this little lecture I've given you is not really in argument form that one would want in a paper. I kind of derived this argument as I went along. What I would do is write a draft this way, but then revise it and put the thesis up front and have sub-claims in each paragraph throughout, developments of the argument in each paragraph, and maybe a tighter conclusion as well. But I think this gives a good example of an analytic argument and maybe how one might derive an analytic argument. Just to kind of recap what I did, was I really started by noticing a paragraph that seemed rich and interesting. What I noticed was a pattern within that paragraph, a bunch of similes. And I asked a question about those similes, what their function is. And it seemed to me that the similes had a parallel with the content. The form had a parallel with the content, that the simile was using the word like, and that the paragraph was also about likeness. So I started to notice this pattern throughout, both of many similes and a kind of emphasis on the stasis in this neighborhood. I ended up connecting this to what I thought was another theme in the story, the disconnect between brothers and difficulty of communication. Finally, I thought that the music and the descriptive language of the music, in terms that, in conversation terms, in describing music as if it were speech, bridges the gap here between both of those parts of the argument. So really, I looked at three kind of how features or formal features, techniques that Baldwin uses in the story. His use of similes, his emphasis on stasis in this neighborhood. I guess actually for his depiction of the inability to communicate between the brothers, and then the way in which he describes music as a form of communication. That all of these come together to express the what of the story, what this story is trying to say. It is trying to say, I think, that that much in the world, alas, especially for African Americans, has remained the same in impoverished neighborhoods, that suffering persists and the world remains the same. But that music poses some music and maybe art by extension. Again, the music is continually compared to a tale. The music and art provide a possibility for connection, perhaps some hope in the darkness, and at the very least, a tale that must be heard and must be told. Okay, that's it for the lecture. The last thing you have to do is just write down the answer to this question to show that you've watched the lecture, and and the question is simple, which is the boy um, the boy that the narrator, excuse me, the narrator's unnamed. It's really annoying. The unnamed narrator sees a boy whistling and compares him to a bird. What did I say is the significance of that comparison, that the boy is compared to a bird? That's an easy enough question. Um, who or what does that uh, boy whistling like a bird evoke? I think that should be an easy question and just show that you didn't just fast forward to the end of this lecture. Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening and watching my face, even when you didn't have to see it in person. I look forward to more discussion with you guys and an opportunity to talk about this lecture as well as some more stories on Tuesday. Okay, take care.